Happy snow day, everybody, because we have our quest coming up Monday for periods 1 and 2 and Tuesdays for period 4. I just wanted to make sure that we finished all of our material. A lot of this you guys will find familiar from your homework, but still pay attention, take some notes. If you need to pause at any time, that's a great idea. Like always, I have written out for you names, dates, important information like that, but I'll also be telling you guys the stories of the fall of the Roman Republic as well. Make sure you check MyBG for questions about this, just so that I can check that you have completed it. I will also post a quick study guide for the quest next week so that you can be well prepared. Before we start, just to remember, First Punic War, of course you guys know, Hamilcar Barca drove the Carthaginian navy, but the Romans won, not because of strategy, not because of the Corvus, the raven that they created, but because of the generosity of the Roman people who donated their money so that Rome could win the First Punic War. And then the Second Punic War, Hannibal, Hamilcar's son, goes to Rome, takes his elephants over the Alps mountains to Italy, and fights against the Romans at Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. Absolutely disastrous for the Romans, but Hannibal loses ultimately once the Romans employ psychological warfare, killing his brother Hasdrubal, throwing his severed head across the walls of his camp, and then of course going to Carthage itself, engaging Hannibal in Africa at the Battle of Zama, and defeating Carthage once and for all. Not all of you finished the Third Punic War, and we said in class it's not really a war as much as it is a genocide against the Carthaginians. Cato the Elder started ending all of his speeches with the famous words, Carthago delenda est, which just means Carthage must be destroyed. The Romans were really scared that Carthage could come back, and then at any moment Carthage would be able to annihilate the Roman Republic. So Scipio Aemilianus went to Africa and completely defeats the city in 146 BC. He doesn't just force it into submission. Scipio Aemilianus destroys the entire city, kills and enslaves all of the surviving Carthaginians, burns the city to the ground, takes it apart brick by brick, and salts the earth so nothing will ever grow. Around the same time, Rome is at war with Greece in what we call the Macedonian Wars. And really what happens here is the Greeks are defeated by the Romans in 4 wars. The Greek capital at this time, Corinth, is destroyed, torn apart brick by brick, just like Carthage. All of the Greeks are sold into slavery from Corinth, and Greece is now part of the Roman Republic, and Rome has control of most of Europe. So Rome has grown a lot since beginning the First Punic Wars. If you look at this map in the purple, that is the size of Rome when the Republic is founded after the rape of Lucretia and the kicking out of Tarquin Superbus. But the purple grows pretty quickly. By the time we have the First Punic War, 264 BC, Rome controls all of Italy. By the end of the Punic Wars in the Macedonian worlds, in the orange there, Rome controls Spain, Rome controls most of modern Switzerland, and Rome controls parts of North Africa, as well as all of Greece and Macedonia. By the time we were going to get to Julius Caesar, who we'll talk about in a second, Rome is also going to control everything that you see in green: Gaul, North Africa, Asia Minor, and a lot of the Greek islands. And so people in Rome started wondering, how are we going to maintain this amount of power? How are we going to possibly keep the Republic? How can we make the Republic apply to this? And not only do we have a lot more land, but we also now have a lot more slaves. Slaves from Carthage, slaves from Greece, slaves from everywhere that Rome has conquered. And what these slaves are going to provide for us is, of course, labor. This free labor is going to be very, very problematic for most Roman citizens because we're going to have the rise of something called latifundia, which you read about in your homework. You know from your homework that latifundia are large estates owned by the very, very wealthy. The aristocrats, after the Punic Wars and the Macedonian Wars, have a lot of money to buy land, and they use this money and they use this land to take over farms. They buy a whole bunch of slaves and they use them as free labor. When you use slaves as labor, you keep 100% of the profits. Most people in Rome are not able to afford to buy hundreds and thousands of slaves. They cannot compete. Small family farms are being outpriced by the very, very wealthy farms. The aristocrats using slaves can afford to charge 50 cents for grain, while as the small family farmers need to feed their families, they have to charge $1 for their grain. They have to shut down their farms, sell them to the aristocrats, and move to the cities. What we get from this is a brand new social class in the Roman Republic of the urban poor. These were family farmers who lose everything because they're being ousted by the latifundia and they're forced to move to the cities. The cities get overcrowded. We have a lot of people begging on the streets. We have a lot of people turning to crime just in order to survive. So what we see is this very huge divide between the wealthy who are owning a latifundia and everybody else. The working class is struggling because they're living with this new urban poor who, like I said, has to often turn to crime. The urban poor are obviously very struggling. They are having trouble eating and they are having trouble just surviving. And so we do have two brothers who step up for the Roman people and see a need for reform, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius, one of the brothers, was actually a war hero of the Third Punic War. He was a very well-respected member of society. But both Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were plebeians, which meant that they were eligible to be tribunes in the tribune of the plebs. If you guys remember, the tribune of the plebs has the power to veto any laws that might be unfair. They also have the power to recommend new legislation. And they're able to kind of force the Senate into passing legislation that they like by vetoing things until the Senate starts to agree. The whole plan of the Gracchi brothers is to divide the latifundia, take away these huge farms that are just making the wealthy even wealthier, and divide the land among war veterans and the urban poor. The war veterans, they feel, defended Rome from utter destruction against the Carthaginians. They deserve to be able to have farms so that they can feed themselves and take care of themselves. The urban poor used to be farmers. If we give them back their farms, then we'll reduce crime in our streets and we will be able to have them help themselves. At the same time, the Gracchi also suggest subsidized grain and clothing to the very poorest so that every single person who lives in the Roman Republic, especially citizens of Rome, will be able to feed their families and clothe their families. The Senate doesn't like this for the very simple reason that the Senate is mostly made up of the very wealthy. The Senate feels that their power, their wealth is being threatened by the Gracchi brothers. They don't want their latifundia taken away. They don't want the land given to the poor. So the Gracchi brothers are mysteriously assassinated by street thugs. Most historians today assume, and historians at the time assume, that these street thugs were actually paid off by the Senate to get rid of the Gracchi brothers. So any attempts at reforming the Roman Republic, trying to help the common people, failed with the Gracchi brothers. About 30 years after the Gracchi brothers, we're going to see a huge shift in army loyalty. A man named Marius comes along who completely changes the structure of the army. He turns volunteer soldiers into a professional army. During the Punic Wars, all soldiers were volunteers, and like we said in class, they provided themselves with their own weapons, which really limited who could be in the army and who could have the top positions in the army. Marius turns the army into a group of soldiers who are paid, who are professional, who are trained, and who are provided with their weapons by the state, by Rome. This enables more and more people to join the army and more people to rise in the ranks of the army. You rise in ranks based on your skill, not based on how much money you have and how many weapons you can afford. This new professional army, though, is going to change how the individual soldiers view their loyalty. Yes, we still have pietas. Yes, we still care about patriotism. We care about honoring the gods. We care about our family. But we have to remember it's our commander who gave us everything that we have. It's our commander who makes sure that we are paid. It's our commander who gives us our training and our weapons. So in reality, who is the army loyal to? Their commanders, even more than the state. Then we're going to get slave revolts. The slaves who are working at the latifundia, you can probably assume, are not treated very well. Think about slaves in the deep American South before the Civil War of America. When we have slaves working on farms who are being taken advantage of so that their owners can make more money, they're not treated well. One slave rises up, a man named Spartacus, who was actually a gladiator. And we'll talk about gladiators a lot more after Thanksgiving, I promise, because everybody loves to learn about gladiators. For those who don't know, gladiators are slaves who are forced to fight each other, oftentimes to the death, for other people's entertainment. Spartacus rises up a group of gladiators, goes into the countryside, rises up a group of slaves working on farms, and starts to revolt. Spartacus, unfortunately, is caught and he is killed. The famous story of Spartacus is that when he is killed, the commander, the Roman military commander who catches him, asks, "Who among you is Spartacus?" so they can kill Spartacus, leader of these revolts. And everybody who helped him, all of the slaves who are fighting with him, stand up and say, "I am Spartacus." Nobody wanted just Spartacus to go down. All of the slaves stood by him. And so as punishment, all of the slaves who participated, hundreds and hundreds of men, were crucified along the most popular highway in ancient Rome. Rome is also dealing with conspiracies. You can probably imagine life in the Roman Republic from Third Punic War, with the Gracchi brothers being killed, with army loyalty shifting, with constant slave revolts like the one led by Spartacus. People in Rome are starting to really not trust the government, and we're going to see a rise in conspiracies. All in all, the Roman Republic is in huge decline, and we have to figure out what it is going to do. Speaking of conspiracies, speaking of revolts, enter Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar was a member of a patrician family. He was one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the Roman Republic. He was born sometime around 100 BC. You guys probably know a lot about Caesar right now after doing your obituaries for him. Probably too much about Julius Caesar. But just to recap, in case you were confused about your primary sources, we're just going to hit some of the highlights of his life. Julius Caesar was most famous for his military campaigns in Gaul. He was a consul, but if you guys remember, consuls were only supposed to have their power for 1 year. Then they were supposed to return to Rome for re-election and reappointment, and then they could go back to their military pursuits. Well, Caesar is in Gaul for over 5 years, and he always saw going back to Rome and seeking reappointment as a waste of his time. So technically, all of his military pursuits are illegal. We read and we know a lot about Caesar because he wrote all about his conquests in a book called De Bello Gallico, which in Latin translates to concerning or about the Gallic War. Caesar's very full of himself in the Gallic War. If you ever read it in English or in Latin, He always talks about himself in the third person. There's always a story where something disastrous is happening to his military, and then, when Caesar noticed this, he fixed everything. But Caesar was a brilliant military commander. Basically all just pro-Caesar propaganda. But anyway, the Senate gets pretty upset that Caesar has engaged in his military conquests illegally. Yeah, he gained Rome a whole lot of land. Yes, he's bringing back a lot of wealth. The Gauls were famous for their goldsmithing. So he's literally coming back to Rome with trunks filled with gold and silver and cages filled with Gallic slaves. He should have been rewarded, but everything he did was illegal. The Senate calls him a traitor and calls him to come back to Rome for trial. At this point, Caesar takes his illegal activities one step forward. As you guys read in your primary source, he crosses the Rubicon River. What this signifies is declaring war on Rome, because you're not supposed to cross the Rubicon with an army unless you are just returning home. They are all equipped, they are all ready to fight, and when he crosses the Rubicon, he shouts the famous words, Alia jacta est, which means the die is cast. In other words, there's no going back. He has declared a civil war. This civil war against his co-consul, Pompey, lasts for 4 years, during which time Caesar does invade the city of Rome with his army. Pompey, though, had already fled. So when Caesar enters the city, there's no bloodshed. And a lot of the people of Rome, when they see his trunks full of gold and silver, when they see all of the slaves he's bringing in, hail him as a hero who is bringing wealth and power to the Roman people. Pompey is forced to flee to Africa. And when he gets to Africa, he actually is assassinated by spies waiting for him. Caesar wins this civil war to thunderous applause. The Roman people give him their full support because of everything that he brought back to Rome. At this point, the Senate, out of pressure from the Roman people, names Caesar dictator for life. If you guys remember, in the Roman Republic, you're only supposed to be dictator for 6 months. Dictator has absolute power and authority. And there's some speculation that maybe Caesar kind of strong-armed the Senate into giving him this title, but really it was the Roman people, once again, who loved Caesar so much the Senate was afraid of a revolt, so they named Caesar dictator for life to appease the common people. The problem is, the term dictator for life sounds a lot like a king. One man, absolute authority, everybody has to listen to him. We know what Rome's history is with king. We know about Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and his awful son Sextus. And we know that Sextus and Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, were overthrown in 509 by a man named Brutus. Brutus's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson is around in 44 BC. Brutus is good friends with Julius Caesar, but he knows that his family took an oath 500 years ago. Lucretia's dying words, never again let there be kings in Rome. And so Brutus and another government official named Cassius lead a conspiracy and a plot to assassinate Julius Caesar. On March 15th, 44 BC, otherwise known as the Ides of March, Brutus and Cassius trap Julius Caesar and murder him on the steps of the Senate Hall. He's stabbed to death 23 times. According to legend, his dying words were as he turned to his murderers, et tu, Brute, which means, even you, Brutus, showing us the ultimate betrayal of Julius Caesar by his friend and showing us Julius Caesar's complete shock and surprise at his assassination. I'm sure you'd be pretty shocked and surprised too if your best friend all of a sudden decided to murder you on March 15th. So, Caesar is dead. Brutus and Cassius have been successful. And when you think about it, Brutus and Cassius think that they are heroes because they just killed a king. Rome hates kings. They don't want kings. Julius Caesar, though, was smarter than a lot of people gave him credit for. Julius Caesar wrote his will just in case anything had ever happened to him. And in Julius Caesar's will, he left the majority of his money, the majority of all that gold and silver he took from Gaul, to the Roman citizens. Not to his family, not to a charity, but to the actual people of Rome. And this money was the equivalent of 1 month's rent or 1 month's mortgage, which might not sound a lot, but when you guys are paying mortgage, when you are paying rent, 1 month where you don't have to worry about that bill is really, really helpful. It allows you to spend your money on other things. It allows you to save. It allows you to pay off debt. This was an extremely generous move. He also donates his private gardens in his huge house as a public park to the Roman citizens. Now remember, the Roman citizens already kind of liked Caesar. He brought back slaves. He brought back gold and silver. He was well loved by the Roman people, and it was the Roman people who had kind of pressured the Senate to name Caesar as dictator for life. Now this guy who has just been murdered leaves behind all of this money to them, leaves behind this public park. Gosh, Caesar was quite a good guy. Why did we kill him? If he had lived longer, maybe he would have accumulated even more wealth and we would have gotten even more. If he had lived longer, maybe he would have reformed the Republic and he would have helped us. Brutus and Cassius suddenly don't look too good. Meanwhile, Julius Caesar's great nephew, named Octavian, inherits Julius Caesar's title, Caesar, and the rest of his money. Octavian and Julius Caesar's right-hand man during his Gallic conquests, Mark Antony, hunt down and defeat Caesar's murderers, Cassius and Brutus. But Octavian and Mark Antony's friendship is very, very tough. Mark Antony thought that he deserved to inherit Caesar's title and the bit of Caesar's wealth that was left after it was distributed to the Roman people. Mark Antony was really jealous of Octavian. And Mark Antony did not like that Octavian had inherited everything. The two start to argue. They try to keep the peace for a little bit. Octavian actually gives his sister, Octavia, to Mark Antony to marry, and they have a couple of kids. But Mark Antony isn't appeased by this. Octavian is young and inexperienced. Antony is skilled and smart. And Mark Antony flees to Egypt to build up an army to attack Octavian and take over the Roman Republic and take over Caesar's heritage. When Mark Antony goes to Egypt, he hooks up with the Egyptian queen at the time, Cleopatra, and the two have a romantic affair. They have a couple of kids. Mark Antony divorces Octavia, the sister of Octavian. Octavia is actually forced to return to Rome in ultimate shame with her kids. Octavian's smart, though. He uses his sister's shame to his advantage. He kind of puts her out in public, which is not a great thing for a brother to do, but he puts her out in public to say, look at what a bad guy Mark Antony is. Look at this beautiful woman that he just left, my poor sister, and look at their poor kids who are now without a father. It's really manipulative and really cruel to do to your sister, but It made everybody really upset with Mark Antony when they saw the poor crying woman and her poor crying kids. And they think about Mark Antony shacking up with a foreign woman, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Well, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, while they're in Egypt, they do get a whole army together. Oh, I had forgotten to mention, just to kind of add to the scandal, it's a fun fact. You're not going to be tested on it. But Cleopatra, before hooking up with Mark Antony, had hooked up with Julius Caesar. And they also had a child together. This was a woman who knew how to use her good looks to take advantage of really powerful men and gain more power and control herself. Don't be like Cleopatra. Anyway, by 31 BC, things between Mark Antony and Octavian have reached a climax. Mark Antony sails to Greece to engage Octavian in a full battle. Octavian marches with all of his army to Greece, but Octavian decides not to engage Mark Antony in battle on the field, but rather to engage him in a naval battle. Mark Antony and Cleopatra had a lot of ships, but Octavian had more. In the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian uses his ships to trap Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the bay and completely destroy their naval fleet. Very few ships of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's survive. One ship bears Mark Antony on it, and he is able to flee. Cleopatra is also able to flee. Octavian has won the Battle of Actium. When Octavian wins the Battle of Actium and Mark Antony flees, word gets to Mark Antony that Cleopatra was killed by the Romans. When Mark Antony hears this, in his absolute heartbreak, he commits suicide. However, Cleopatra was not dead. He heard a false report. Now word gets back to Cleopatra that Mark Antony has just killed himself. Cleopatra is being held in a Roman prison, but she is able to sneak in a poisonous snake, which she allows to bite her neck so that she may also die. I tell you this story because it is the original Romeo and Juliet story. One thinks the other is dead, kills himself, then the other finds out that her lover has just died and she also kills herself. So Shakespeare, totally ripping off history. All right, so Octavian has just won the Battle of Actium. Mark Antony and Cleopatra are dead, and Octavian sails back to Rome, where he is greeted as a hero. The way that Rome sees this, we had this awful civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Julius Caesar won, and then Julius Caesar was murdered. Julius Caesar left all of his stuff to the Roman people. We love Julius Caesar. We had another civil war when Mark Antony and Octavian tracked down Brutus and Cassius and killed them. Then Mark Antony and Octavian started arguing. Mark Antony abandoned Rome to go to Egypt, hooked up with a foreign queen, and then declared war on Rome, initiating a third civil war. What Octavian has just done in the eyes of the Roman people is he has stopped a foreign invasion, and he has stopped and won a third civil war. And yes, you know, the Caesars were responsible for all of these civil wars. And if Julius Caesar had just obeyed the law, nothing like this would have happened in the first place. But we're not going to think about that. We're just going to think about how the Caesars, Julius and Octavian, have won every civil war for Rome. And we like them now because Caesar gave us money. Octavian stopped a foreign invasion. The Caesars are great. So when Octavian comes back to Rome, the Senate is very, very happy with him. And they actually promise to give him anything that he wants. Octavian's wife, Livia, has big dreams. She likes the idea of Octavian possibly being a king, but Octavian and Livia are smart enough to know that if they ask for a kingship, they're going to be assassinated because that's what Rome does to kings. So they're very, very careful about what they ask for. Instead of being called a king, Octavian asks to be called Augustus, which means the exalted one. Augustus actually has a lot of religious undertones. It means one who is close to the gods. It means one who has a lot of power and authority. So it's a very, very important title for him to get. He also receives the title of princeps, which means first citizen. This isn't a king. It's the first citizen. A king means one person rules over everybody else. A princeps means all of us are citizens, but I'm the first. I'm the best citizen. We're all equal, guys, but I'm most equal. That's princeps. Again, not king, but the most equal among all the equals. If you're really, really confused by this, that's okay, because it is really confusing. If you're wondering to yourself, how is this possibly different from a king? That's a great question, but it's the words that matter. Words are very, very manipulative. Guys, I'm not king. I'm just like you. I'm just a little bit better than you, but just a little bit. I'm princeps. I'm first among equals. Augustus initiates a brand new kind of government because he's princeps, because he has this new title, because the Senate is willing to give him anything that he wants. This is the death of the Republic. We still have consuls, we still have tribunes, we still have a Senate, but guess who's really in control? Augustus, Octavian, the princeps. Augustus allows certain cities and provinces to govern with some independence. Governors are instituted to help rule the huge amount of land currently covered by Rome. But all of those governors and provinces must listen to Augustus. One time that we're going to see after Thanksgiving break how these provinces can rule themselves is the trial of Jesus Christ in the Roman province of Judea. If you guys remember from your Bible class, when Jesus Christ is brought to trial, he is first brought among his own people, the Jews. The Jews, however, do not have a death penalty, so they give him over to the Romans. And Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, is allowed to make the decision to kill Jesus Christ without consulting Augustus. So those governors have some authority, but if at any point the emperor, the Caesar, commanded the governor to do something, they had to listen. This new government also allows Augustus to make laws, to enforce laws, to control the finances, to control the armies. He has last say and complete authority over everything. Augustus is also going to put in place some new economic reforms focused on helping the people. Again, the people have so much power in Rome. It's the people who save us during the First Punic War. It's the people who welcome back Julius Caesar. It's the people who pressure the Senate to give Julius Caesar the title of dictator for life. We need to appease the people. Augustus's economic reforms are all focused on the family and the citizens of Rome. He initiates a census. There hadn't been really good records of all of the people of Rome and what they owned and where they lived, because we've had Punic Wars, we've had assassinations, we've had military reforms, we've had slave revolts, we've had 3 civil wars. Rome has been in chaos. Augustus calms it down. What's your name? Who's your family? Where do you live? What do you own? He also creates a postal service so that Rome can spread messages throughout its vast empire. and he creates a uniform system of currency all around Rome. Other economic reforms that he creates are tax breaks to people with kids. If you are a family and you have kids, your expenses are pretty high. If you don't believe me, ask your parents. You are very expensive. So Augustus initiates tax breaks for people with families. He also tries to do anything he can to really support family life in the whole of Rome. Civil services, Augustus is going to completely rebuild the city of Rome. Historians call this Augustus turning it from a city of clay to a city of marble. Rome as a city before Augustus is not super impressive. It's a bunch of brick buildings. Augustus comes along, he rebuilds everything with marble. And after our Thanksgiving break, we're going to look at some of the art and culture and mythology of Rome. We're going to look at gladiator fights. We're going to look at the things that Augustus built, and we're going to really see how Augustus transforms the city. But for now, that's it. When we come back, we'll also talk about further history, how Augustus is going to initiate the line of what we call the Julio-Claudians. If you guys can make any sense out of this family tree, you'll see it's a little complicated. We're not going to memorize the whole thing. But what this is going to show us is how Augustus is going to continue his role of princeps into what we now call an empire, with power being passed down through the family. Again, sounds a lot like kings, but it's not kings. It's the first people among equals. So please check MyBG for questions to answer about this, just so I can check in that you did this. And I will also post a little bit of a study guide. If any of you want to email me with questions about your quest, please do. I will be checking my email throughout the day today, Friday. Tomorrow, Saturday, I actually have a baby shower, so I won't be checking email then. But then on Sunday, I will also be checking my email. Monday, if any of you want to talk to me before homeroom, I should be in room 220 by 7:20 a.m. And I'm happy to help you with any questions you may have. Period 4, you can see me after school Monday with any questions. Have a wonderful snow day. Good luck with the rest of your assignments. I hope you help your parents with some of this snow cleanup. I also hope that you get a lot of rest. And I'll see you guys next week.